Great. Thanks a lot, Wendy. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, depending on where in the world you are dialing in from. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Agile and how it relates to project management. And so I thought it made sense to start with a little bit of context. I've been in application development and IT project management for almost 25 years. And probably about 20 years ago, Agile came out as a development methodology, right, to talk about how teams can deliver and release code quicker. In the last, call it 5 to 10 years, it's evolved into something called Scaled Agile, which is a much larger construct that includes entire organizations, entire enterprises. And for those who look at the Agile models and sort of read what's on the side of the box when you pick these things up, you realize there's not a title called project manager, and there's no construct called a project. And so I would argue, and the whole premise of this webinar is to talk about how project management is still very much relevant in these models. The competencies are still needed, the concepts are still important, and so on. So that's sort of the backdrop for today. Before we go into it, so there's really three things. When I think of Agile, I think about it sort of in three ways. So there's Agile as a delivery methodology, right? And you think about the Agile Manifesto and things like scrums and sprints and iterative development, really things at the team level and how teams change their delivery methodology from historical methods such as waterfall and so on, and into this more Agile delivery, again at a team level. Then we talk about Scaled Agile, which is, at an enterprise level, if you've seen these frameworks, there's multiple levels and dimensions associated to them and very specific roles that apply to each level, specific scope decomposition and a cadence of ceremonies and so on. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And then there's Agile principles, right? A set of principles from which we should operate and deliver against. So, today's conversation is really talking about Scaled Agile, right? That multi-layer Scaled Agile model. So this may look familiar too. This is my sort of version of it, but for purposes of this conversation, and I know there's a few different frameworks out here, I'm going to talk about SAFE, the Scaled Agile framework, that Dean Leffingwell and crew has been deploying, and the version specifically is 4.5 for those tracking along at home. And what you see is there's multiple layers in the Scaled Agile model, right? So starting from the bottom up, you have Scrum teams at the team level that aggregate into these Agile release trains or ARTs. And in some cases, those aggregate into larger constructs known as solution trains. And then at the top layer, you've got this portfolio layer, and then a bunch of shared services that span across. So hopefully for those dialing in, you have sort of a grounding in SAFE and Scaled Agile, and a model like this should look somewhat familiar. The intention today, though, by the way, is not to get into a deep conversation on the specifics of the Scaled Agile framework so much as use it as a reference point to talk about some of the project management concepts and principles. A couple really important points to the new Scaled Agile model, very different than what's happened in past decades, is first, it's all about the team, right? So the team is at the center of the model. It's all about how do we maximize the delivery and the velocity and the cohesiveness of the team with minimal oversight. The flow of work and information is really important, and I've got a couple slides on that ahead of how sort of scope decomposes down at the top level, gets more focused, and then sort of information actually aggregates back up. We've moved to a model where there's persistent teams, right? Teams that have the same resources for long periods of time, because that improves their velocity, it improves their productivity, and so on. And those teams are funded. So in this model, scope isn't funded, teams are funded, and those teams have backlogs of work, which gets prioritized and sequenced. And then there's a very specific cadence, right? Whether it's iterations or sprints or program increments, there's a sort of a cadence of those things, and they aggregate up, and there's ceremonies aligned to each of those with things like planning and demonstrations. There's not really a formal status report, right? So information is used in the context of the delivery tools, and Rally and Jira are two examples of those, and the information is gathered there as opposed to pushed out in sort of a big status report sort of central function. And then lastly, decision-making is done at the team level, right, with the people who have the knowledge. It's done decentralized, and clearly there's still some strategic decisions that need to happen at a top level. But these are a couple of really important concepts that have evolved in the Scaled Agile model, and they're relevant for us as project management professionals. And so we think about the implications of these things on our work. So the rows here, we think about sort of classic project management functions, and we'll talk about how they evolve in the Scaled Agile model. And so I've already talked about scope management, where we move from a model where there's fixed scope into a model where the teams are fixed, and it's actually a constant prioritization of backlogs, right? These living backlogs of scope that gets prioritized. And therefore, there's not really a formal change management process where you have to go through and get governance approval. It's part of what's known as grooming the backlogs. We talked about governance. Instead of sort of phase gates and approvals and large meetings with lots of people, you get to these demonstrations where specific working code is demonstrated that has specific iterations, specific acceptance criteria, and so on. Mentioned that financials, right, not tied to projects and scope so much as persistent teams and the capacity of those teams to do work. From a schedule perspective, milestones are still important, but they're sort of tied to scope elements and these ceremonies and cadence. We move from a model where resources move between projects to where they're dedicated on those persistent teams. And then lastly, instead of sort of business helping define the scope up front and then coming back later to help test, business involvement is consistent throughout the life cycle. And again, the intention today is not to go sort of deep in this. I'm assuming that most people on this call are sort of familiar with some of these foundational elements, but it's an important grounding to talk about the major hypotheses of this webinar, and there's 4 of them presented on the screen. So the first is, I would argue that there's still the concept of projects, but that the definition evolves. I fundamentally believe there's absolutely still a need for project management competencies. So those competencies that make people successful in the project management world, I believe, are those competencies that are critical for the Scaled Agile roles. I still believe, number 3, that there's a need for portfolio management functions, but those also evolve. And lastly, if you look at the Agile principles, I believe there's a relationship between those and project management principles. So let's dive into the first one. As talked about before, if I think about scope, this is a sort of a picture I drew to help demonstrate the point, right? You can see the multiple layers of our Scaled Agile model. And at each layer, the scope sort of flows down and decomposes, right? So starting with a theme, it decomposes down into epics, which get decomposed into features and stories, each of which having lower levels of details and acceptance criteria and so on. And what you'll see in the legend is each one of these layers also has an intake function and a backlog from which that work gets managed and groomed. So again, in Scaled Agile, the scope sort of decomposes down.
Hi there, hope you enjoyed that last clip. My name is Michael Malutis, and if you'd like to watch the full 60 minutes of that last webcast, while also gaining complete unlimited access to our entire library of IT learning, simply visit our subscribe page at greatpro.org/subscribe. Unlimited annual access is $199 per year, but if you use the coupon code LEARN2EARN, you can drop that membership fee to just $149. That's less than $13 per month for unlimited access to over 1,000 hours of on-demand career development, covering the entire spectrum of IT management best practices, including business analysis and requirements, software development, quality and testing, risk management, process improvement, project management, and even digital transformation. But your membership doesn't just give you unlimited access to our vast learning library. You also get free access to our mobile app, as well as direct access to our network of over 300 of the world's leading IT consultants, all of whom are dedicated to putting practical knowledge at your fingertips so that you can learn more and earn more. I hope you will join me in becoming a member of the Great IT Professional and advancing your career with us. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button above so that you get notified whenever we publish new free webcasts each week of the year. Thank you for your time and best wishes for your continued success.